And the doctors there said, "What's wrong with you?" And I'm like, "There's nothing wrong with me. I've had this pain in my side. I've been a little lightheaded for the last 3 or 4 months. And I'm ready to go home." And the doctor said, "We're ready to send you home. Just let's get your blood work back and see what's going on with that." And when my blood work came back, my hemoglobin was 5.0. It's supposed to be a 15. And the doctor said, "If you had come in as a trauma patient, I don't know that you'd still be alive because
Wow.
your hemoglobin is so dangerously low." He said to me, "Where are you bleeding to death?" And I said, "I'm not." I come from a really ordinary background. I come from a small town. I come from a family that didn't have a lot of money. I come from a very ordinary place and ordinary schooling. But the one thing that is not ordinary is the family I was born into. He would call and ask me what I was grateful for, and I would nearly spit. I was just like, "No, I'm not." And he would say, "Let's just write 2 things down." I'd be like, no, Dad. But he did it every single day. And I got to the place where I had this little red notebook, and all of this really chokes me up now because I lost my dad last August. But he was so determined to get me to a place where I was recognizing that my life wasn't a pit. And he was right.
That was Bunny Terry. I met Bunny nearly a year ago. My oldest daughter, Christina, introduced us when I was visiting Santa Fe, New Mexico. A picture of health with a sunny disposition, I never would have guessed that Bunny had faced death with a diagnosis of such severity that her friend even remarked, "This is the end." But it wasn't. Bunny not only survived this deadly diagnosis, but she did so because of the support of an amazing network of family and friends. And her father, who called her daily and asked, "Honey, what are you grateful for today?" As Bunny explains in this episode, most people have no idea how grueling chemotherapy for colon cancer really is. The side effects are horrible. And there was surgery, too. And yet, with the patient persistence of her father's calls, Bunny learned that even in the depths of this terrible disease, there is much to be grateful for. Her daily practice of gratitude became an important part of her healing journey. Join me in my conversation with this remarkable cancer survivor, Bunny Terry. I'm your host, Mark Good, and this is Remarkable, a podcast focused on people and stories worthy of your attention. And now, today's show. This is Mark Good, and this is my Remarkable podcast, and I'm delighted to have as a guest today Bunny Terry, who's in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Bunny, introduce yourself to our listeners, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. As Mark said, my name is Bunny Terry. I am a native New Mexican and a cancer advocate, a realtor by trade, but also a writer and a creator, and just mostly curious about the world. So
wow, that's
wonderful.
How
I like to describe myself. Yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you for being a guest on our show. I'm so excited. In fact, I was going to write a little piece this afternoon to kind of get people ready for this episode, and was going to be talking about how we became acquainted. My surprise visit to Christina and Kat last summer, and then Christina threw a party for Kat, and there you and your husband joined us.
That was so much fun. It's first of all, your daughter and her wife are 2 of my favorite humans in the world, but also, sort of what I've learned, and this may be true in every other city, but in Santa Fe, we sort of create our own community. And that's what Christina and Kat have done, both with their restaurant and with their friends. And so it was no surprise to meet somebody that we immediately liked, which was you. My husband and I both. We were so Well, we just want to get to know you better, Mark. That's and
Well,
that's high praise because we don't. Toby especially doesn't always say that. So
well, thank you. I feel the same way. And later on this coming summer, Pam and I plan to visit. I want to introduce you to my bride, and we can't wait to spend some time in Santa Fe. It's one of our favorite places to visit. But what I'd like to do is to dive right in, because when Christina introduced you to me, she goes, "Daddy, I'd like you to meet my friend Bunny," which, by the way, is, I have to tell you this funny story. So your name, Bunny, is my term of endearment for my wife. So when I was scheduling this podcast, we kind of keep a joint calendar, right? I said, podcast with Bunny. And Pam said to me, are we doing a podcast? I said, nope, it's a different Bunny. It's the Santa Fe Bunny. But
it is.
When Christina introduced me to you, she said, "Dad, I know you'll enjoy meeting Bunny," but she said she's written a book, and I think you would find it really interesting. And that night, she loaned me her copy, and I dove right into it. And I was really stunned because the story of your book, in fact, kind of the subtitle of it is that, and I'll just give the listeners kind of a top line here, is that you were diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And I want us to walk through kind of what happened. But then, as a key part of your story, is the role that gratitude played in your healing and your recovery. And it's such an unusual thing, because most of the time when we hear people talk about cancer and their recovery from cancer, and heaven hope that everyone who is afflicted with that disease does recover, frequently the things that they talk about is the medical therapy, the regimen, maybe a change in eating, a lot of other things. I've never heard anyone ever say that gratitude played an important role in my recovery. And so I'd like you to kind of take us through your story, your journey. What happened? How did you get ill? And kind of let's start at the beginning.
Mark, I've always thought I've always been sort of almost arrogant about my good health. The only time I was ever in the hospital was when I had my children, and that was, overnight. And then I, just rallied and went home and went right back to work. And so in November of 2012, I had just moved to Santa Fe and was really excited to start this new life. My daughter had gone away to college, and she was everybody was out of the house. I was single. I had always wanted to live in Santa Fe all my life since I was 6 years old. Mm. And when I visited in 1966, I thought, I'm going to live here. I didn't know it would take me quite so long. But at the time that I moved, I really felt like I had the world by the tail. And there was this side benefit to moving to Santa Fe. I thought it was moving to Santa Fe, where I had also lost a lot of weight and I was in great physical shape. And I had a pain in my side for one day. And it got worse overnight. And I start the book with a story of a blind date that I had on a Thursday evening. And I was like, I think my blind date made me sick. So I got up the next morning and went to urgent care thinking that maybe I had a bad case of the stomach flu. And instead, the doctor sent me to the ER saying, I think you have appendicitis. And I got to the ER, and the doctors there said, "What's wrong with you?" And I'm like, "There's nothing wrong with me. I've had this pain in my side. I've been a little lightheaded for the last 3 or 4 months, and I'm ready to go home." And the doctor said, "We're ready to send you home. Just let's get your blood work back and see what's going on with that." And when my blood work came back, my hemoglobin was 5.0. It's supposed to be a 15. And the doctor said, if you had come in as a trauma patient, I don't know that you'd still be alive, because your hemoglobin is so dangerously low. He said to me, "Where are you bleeding to death?" And I said, "I'm not."
Right.
And I've learned now that those are very classic symptoms, especially in women. That I was 51 at the time, so I had not had my first colonoscopy. I just, I was busy, I was moving, I was healthy. I didn't you're supposed to have a colon. At that time, it was 50, and I hadn't had one yet. And they admitted me to the hospital and did a colonoscopy the next day and discovered that I had a 5.5 centimeter tumor in my ascending colon that had perforated my colon wall, and the reason that there was no blood in my stool. And I'm happy to talk about blood in your stool, because I think that one of the things we don't do very well is talk about the things that if we talked about them, not so many people wouldn't be diagnosed with colon cancer. But I had no blood in my stool because the blood was seeping into my abdomen.
Oh,
So
no.
my colon wall was perforated, and I had this tumor that, we don't know metric system very well in America, but it was the size of a small plum.
Right.
And then I had a similar tumor. The reason it was stage 4 is that I had a similar tumor on my liver, a little bit smaller. It was, let's see, 5.5 in my colon and 4.5 centimeters on my liver. And Mark, I was so ignorant. I didn't even know that cancer was staged.
Oh, gosh.
At the time, I was
Well,
like, well, what's stage 4? And my friend who was with me there said, there's no stage 5. I think this is the worst it can get. And
well,
and
that's a helpful comment for a friend to make.
I know. Well,
You're
she
at
and I were
the,
both
you're at
kind of
the end.
scratching our head. I mean, there's this is, there's a lot more detail in the book because it was so shocking. And now that I'm away from that, that was in 2012. And now I know how this affected everybody else, how it affected the people in my family. But I was sort of like, well, so what? We'll get through this. But it was between the time that I was diagnosed and I was pronounced all clear after I had surgery at MD Anderson, there was a series of, 12 chemo sessions, a major surgery where part of my 12 inches of my colon were removed and part of my liver, and then another series of sessions, and a prognosis from my oncologist at the time that I had 12 months to live.
Okay.
All of which.
But there's something in your book that I read that I think would be helpful also for people to understand. And I want to return to your journey and actually talk about friends and family and, support and so forth. Where were you from the standpoint of health insurance when this happened?
Oh, well, talk about arrogant. In February of 2012, I made a decision to cancel my health insurance because I was, healthy. I only went to the doctor once a year. I was paying all this money for health insurance, and I had found myself in a bit of a pit financially because I'd had this really bad breakup, and my roommate had moved out while he was dating. He was dating somebody else while he was dating me, so he had to move out. But I didn't have health insurance when I was diagnosed.
Oh, wow. So how did you, because this is it's not only everyone's worst nightmare, it is the experience of a lot of Americans that they get diagnosed with some serious malady. And whether it's because of a breakup, relational problem, or in the case of many people, it's just so friggin' expensive to have health insurance that they don't. What happened to you? How did you go from diagnosed with cancer, stage 4, uninsured, to being able to get chemo? Take us through that process a little bit.
Well, I was diagnosed on November 10th.
Okay.
And I got in touch with my insurance guy and said, what do I do? And there actually is, and that was in 2012, but I do think that this still exists in a lot of states. There is a catastrophic insurance pool that you can get into. And luckily we now have the Affordable Health Care Act that says you can't be denied health insurance because you have a pre-existing condition. I think that prior to that, there's a lot of controversy about that, the Health Care Act, but I'm telling you, doing away with that pre-existing loophole for for health insurance made a huge difference for a lot of people. So I had to delay my chemo for a month while I waited to get qualified and then for my coverage to begin. After that, I had pretty decent coverage, but um, not money to pay for it. My kids had to pay for my health insurance. When I look back on it, I'm just like, I was in such a bad place financially. But
so many of us, and when I say us, I mean Americans, I think the number is like 40% of Americans couldn't handle a $1,000 catastrophe. And I
right.
can't imagine what it would cost to go from zero to coverage in a month, even to get on a catastrophic plan. I mean, and then the out of pocket and the deductible.
Oh, it was so because I started in December, and of course I met my deductible almost immediately. And my deductible was $6,000. And, luckily for me, I had just sold a house. This was going to be, I had a little nest egg. I'm telling you, it was small,
right,
that I was going to eventually put into a home of my own, maybe here. And that may have been like a mobile home, but I had this tiny nest egg, and I flew through that in December and in January, because I had to pay my out of pocket in December, and then I had the rollover, and we started again in January. Luckily, the small town that I grew up in, Logan, New Mexico, had some benefits where they raised money for me, and that was extremely helpful. But I don't know how people who don't have those resources survive this sort of a diagnosis financially.
Well,
and Mark, it's what people think about all the time.
Well,
I mean, I work for a nonprofit, or I serve as a volunteer for a nonprofit where we help people with really basic needs, because if you're worried about money all the time, it's hard to find a way to get better health-wise.
Oh, that's so true. That's so true.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to when you were diagnosed. Okay, so they discover that you have these two tumors, right? One on your colon, one on your liver.
Right.
And they explain to you as if I had been diagnosed with cancer at your age, right? And somebody had said stage 4, I would have been like your friend. Well, no, I wouldn't have been like your friend. I would have been like, well, what's stage 4? How many stages are there? 10?
Right.
10?
Right.
I mean, explain to me. Right. So when all of that sort of was made clear to you, and when they said, okay, here's what your prognosis looks like, did you ever go, well, this is it? I've lived a good life, and I guess 51 or 52 is all I'm going to live? Or, I mean, how did you react to, because that's, for many people, that is in fact a death sentence. For you, it wasn't. But for many people, that actually turns out to be a death sentence, because stage 4 is catastrophic. I mean, how did you process that mentally?
I never believed that this was going to be the thing that ended my life. I suspect that's true of a lot of people. And what I will say is that everybody's journey is different. I had a really great friend at almost the same time who was diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer, and he was my age. And he was a medical doctor. And because he was in that field, he said to his wife, "This is what will kill me." And he was right. And everybody's journey is different. And mine was that my son and his wife were expecting their first child. My daughter was a senior in college. I had this huge loving family. And I mean, it was just like I'm sorry, Mark, but death, for me, it felt like death was not an option. So we didn't, even when we got the letter the prognosis came in the form of a letter from my doctor so that I could claim my life insurance early.
Right.
You can cash out your life insurance early. And my doctor said, you may need this. And he wrote this letter that said, it described me, and it said prognosis is 12 months. And we got it from the doctor, and it's a chapter in the book. And my daughter and I looked at it, and I said, we're not sending this to anybody because it's not true. It can't be the truth, and it's not going to be the truth. But there was a lot of wrestling with trying to figure out for lack of a better term, it sounds really cliche, but these things are cliche because they're true. I started trying to figure out, well, what is my life, and what is it worth? And you know, I come from a really ordinary background. I come from a small town. I come from a family that didn't have a lot of money. I come from a very ordinary place and ordinary schooling. But the one thing that is not ordinary is the family I was born into. And my parents never, for first of all, they're people of great faith. So they prayed nonstop while I was going through this process, but they also called every day and wanted an update. And that's where the whole gratitude piece came in, is that my dad would say to me every evening, and I'm telling you, as you well know, as everybody knows from either their own experience or somebody else's that they love, chemo is grueling and it's awful. And especially when it's the kind of chemo I had that was attacking these cells in my gut, you can imagine what it was like. And my dad would call and he would say, "Tell me what you're grateful for today." And I would be like, "You must be kidding." I mean, I did not come to this gratitude piece very willingly. I was like, "Dad, my hair is thinning. My skin is getting icky. My gums are bleeding. I have a bloody nose all the time. There are all these weird side effects that people don't know about. My nails got really icky, and I had the easy stuff. I mean, there are people I know who couldn't walk because they had such bad neuropathy in their hands and feet.
Wow.
Or they couldn't swallow because the chemo, there's a lot of colon cancer chemo that makes you really sensitive to heat or cold, so that you can't eat. If you drink water that's not like room temperature, you feel like you're choking. So there are all these other side effects that I didn't get, but he would call and ask me what I was grateful for, and I would nearly spit. I was just like, "No, I'm not." And he would say, "Let's just write two things down." I'd be like, "No, Dad." But he did it every single day. And I got to the place where I had this little red notebook, and all of this really chokes me up now because I lost my dad last August. But he was so determined to get me to a place where I was recognizing that my life wasn't a pit. And he was right. But in the beginning, it was like, well, I'm grateful that I have this full bottle of Ambien so that I can sleep at night, or, I have less diarrhea today than I had yesterday. It was minimal, but it really is a practice, and consistency really matters. And after a couple of weeks, it became a matter of being grateful for the stuff that really mattered. It wasn't just, well, I'm glad this other horrible thing didn't happen to me, but it was more, here are some great things that happened in my life every single day. And it was surprising to do that in the midst of this other ugliness.
Well, I would think so. And I think that's when I first learned about your book and learned about your story. And of course, you highlight gratitude in the title of your book and talk about that. I was really, as they say, either the British would say I was gobsmacked, or as others would say I was flummoxed. I was really confused because I practice gratitude sort of sporadically. I'm not as good. And I love that your dad called you every day. First of all, that's a wonderfully supportive, person to have in your life. Your dad, that's such love. And that he would encourage you to think of your life in that moment, that day, in terms of gratefulness, which is pretty astounding. I mean, because you're right, so many of us, and I include myself in this, tend to frame my perspective about a moment in time or a day sort of circumstantially. What's going on with me, right? Do I like before, we've recorded this podcast, my wife and I had been at the gym and I worked out. I was feeling great, but that's good. But that's because I worked out, and I'm grateful that I can work out at my age. I think that's great. But to have someone call and lovingly encourage you to think about gratitude while you're struggling with colon cancer is pretty remarkable. But I guess I want to ask you, though, because as a what I want to call kind of a spiritual practice that can be and often is for people transformative. But in your narrative, you believe there's a connection between the practice of gratitude, which your dad, gently encouraged you to move into, and your ultimate recovery from cancer. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, and I always want to preface that by saying, like I said before, everybody's journey is different, and I had a podcast for a long time called the Life Saving Gratitude Podcast. So I don't want to say that people who don't survive aren't doing their own practices that make a difference in their life. But for me, and given what I've studied since then, I know that mindset, and there are a lot of doctors that agree with this, and there's a lot of research that agrees with it, that mindset has a huge effect on healing, and that patients who choose to, it can be, watching funny video, patients who choose to laugh every day, or patients who choose to express gratitude every day. I don't know the secret, and I don't know that there's a science to it, but to me, I think it was a huge part of my survival. I just know, and part of that may be that I was willing to do whatever it took to get well and stay well. And if that meant shifting my perception so that I just didn't focus on how miserable I was, because it's really easy to focus on that.
Sure.
I'm telling you, Mark, it's not just that it helped, that I believe it helped me survive. It's a really important part of my life now. I mean, I feel like life is magical, and I can't believe that I get to live this life and that I get to do the things that I get to do now. And I think that still comes from this daily practice of, even on days when I want to throttle everybody I see, saying, this life is magic. I'm so grateful for it. And in my dad's words, which we didn't say this before, but it's really important for people to know that my dad hardly ever had two nickels to rub together. He was a dryland farmer. He was raising 4 kids. He was the youngest of 10 children. This is a guy who never, ever, ever had $30 in a savings account in the bank. And yet, if you asked him how he was doing every day of his life, he would say, if things were any better, I'd have to be 2 people. And that's where that came from, is that he never saw his life as less than or emptier than or poorer than anybody else's. He saw himself as, and my mom too, I've got to give her credit too, but dad was more verbal about it. He taught us all that we were really ultimately amazingly blessed, even when things were terrible.
Well, and what's so wonderful to hear about this, because it's a marvelous counterpoint to our culture. And when I say our culture, I mean the United States. We live in a world in which everything has been so monetized, including what we deem to be important in life. We tend to think of that in financial terms. If I make a certain amount of money, then I'll be happy. And I don't mean to say that financial struggle isn't real. It is real. And there are a lot of people that are struggling. And I take nothing away from the heartbreak and the difficulty of that. I don't mean to suggest that. But I don't believe, and I think your dad and your life is a testimony to this, that the secret to happiness is cash. I mean, it makes a difference, yes, but ultimately, I think what I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the gratitude practice that your dad helped you develop helped you appreciate, first of all, the community, the wonderful, loving community that was around you and still is around you, that loves and supports you. And that was the real wealth, and is the real wealth of life. It's the life we live in community with other people. The fact that your dad did or did not have $30 to his name has nothing to do with his significance and the joy that he experienced as a person and the love that he was able to share with his children and others, I suspect.
Oh, when my dad passed away, people came out of the woodwork. Kids, even young men. My mom said when people came by the house, she would say, I had no idea that this person even, and she would be surprised. Young men would come by the house sobbing, saying, I can't believe that Kenneth isn't going to be in our life anymore. He was 91. He had lived a long time. And these like young men in their 30s would say, he never stopped. He never ever failed to stop and shake my hand and pat me on the arm and tell me I was doing a good job. And I think the ultimate success, like you said, lies in loving your community and caring for it and being grateful in the middle of it. And I didn't know those things until the last year or so, that the way that you have an impact in the world is showing other people true, unconditional care and love, and that they're important.
Absolutely.
I mean, I was so shocked. Yeah.
Well, and, for you to have learned that lesson while recovering from stage 4 cancer makes it even a sort of sweeter and more powerful insight, because I know of people that have struggled with deep illnesses and problems and have been resentful that their life is going to perhaps end, right? Mm-hmm. But I do believe you were very fortunate and are very fortunate, because it's present tense, it's not just past tense, to have a community of loving and supportive people around you. And I think for our people who are listening to this, one of the takeaways, aside from the gratitude practice that you talk about in your book, is how important it is to nurture those relationships, those vital relationships, whether it's family or friends, neighbors, whatever, is to show love and be open to receiving love throughout the sort of the narrative of your life.
It is. It is. So here's the other thing, and this may not be a popular viewpoint, but I can say now, and I have heard this from other people in the community that I'm in, I'm grateful that I had that cancer experience. It changed my life. It made me better. It made me pay more attention. I've lost a lot of friends to this disease because I've become part of this cancer clique where I know a lot of people who are in the middle of it or who didn't survive it. And I do want to say that that's just another piece of my gratitude, that I had people in my life who helped me pay attention while I was in it, and then to learn what my life was for once it was over.
Wow. That's powerful. Bunny, thank you so much for sharing your story. We'll have in the show notes a link to your website. I visited just today. As a matter of fact, I hadn't been there in a while. And so they can find how to get access to your book.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. This is so fun.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate your time, buddy. I'm Mark Good. You've been listening to my remarkable podcast. For more episodes like this, as well as premium content, visit my site, markgood.substack.com.